The platform of reformation was so constructed as to promise the accomplishment of this desirable object. The system of faith laid down in the Confession and Catechisms was substantially the same with what was declared in the Confessions and Catechisms of all the Reformed on the continent. The form of church government was according to the Word of God and the example of the best Reformed churches. Public worship was set free from the trammels of a formal and stinted liturgy, and at the same time duly guarded by the Directory, which, while it held forth such things as are of divine institution in every ordinance, regulated others according to the rules of Christian prudence, agreeable to the general rules of the Word of God, and gave such instructions to ministers as tended to produce a consent of all the churches in those things that contain the substance of the service and worship of God. The more narrowly the proceedings of the assembly which prepared the model of religious reformation and uniformity are looked into, the more I am persuaded will it appear that, in the conclusions to which they came, particularly on the controversies which arose at that time among the friends of religion, they displayed a healing and moderate spirit, combined with an enlightened regard to truth and the general welfare of the Church, which showed them to be uncommonly fitted for the great task which Providence assigned to them, and which has not been displayed in the same degree by any assembly, extraordinary or ordinary, which the world has since seen. The second thing to which I alluded as meriting particular notice in this work is the extensive scale on which it was undertaken. Its object was not only to reform and unite, but to reform religion and settle unity through three kingdoms. Nor was this all. Though called more immediately to provide for their own safety and to promote Christianity in that part of the world where they dwelt, those who embarked in it did not confine their views to this object. They had before their eyes the security of the true religion, and professors thereof in all places, the forming of an association among other Christian churches, and in general the enlargement of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. These ends, expressed in their solemn bond of confederation, were never lost sight of in the prosecution of their undertaking. Theirs was no narrow, contracted, or sectarian plan. On the contrary, it was one of their principal objects in all that they did to testify their charity and conformity to all the Reformed churches, to abolish those restrictions which had prevented free intercourse with them, and to secure union, communion, and cooperation with them upon the great principles of Christianity and Protestantism. Under both of these important views was the Reformation adopted by the seceders. In publishing their testimony, their language on the matter was, "We have no peculiar principles. We abide by and declare our adherence to those books which are still professedly owned by the National Church of Scotland, and which were agreed on as the standards of religious uniformity in the three nations. We are willing to hold communion with all who shall be found consistently adhering to these, and to them as a subordinate test we are ready to submit the decision of every point which forms the subject of dispute and controversy between us and others." The same language all true adherents of the cause of the Reformation still continue to hold. The same offers they still make, in vindicating their secession and stating its grounds. They were necessarily led to give greater prominence to the state of religion in Scotland, and to their contendings with the judicatories of that church, with which they had been intimately connected. But they did not allow these to engross their regard. They considered it as a high duty to promote religion in England and Ireland, which are as much interested in the cause of the secession, rightly understood, as Scotland. When they complied with petitions from these countries and erected congregations in consequence of them, they did not lay themselves open to the charge of enlisting followers under the standard of a party, or engaging them in local controversies in which they had no concern, but could plead with the utmost truth that they only embodied them under principles and obligations which were common to the three nations. In fine, while they considered themselves bound to do what in them lay to enlarge the kingdom of Christ, they reckoned that they had a special call to send the gospel to those distant parts of the world where there were settlers from this country. And by the exertions which they made in this way from an early period, multitudes have enjoyed the means of religious instruction and salvation who otherwise would have been left totally destitute of them. When the secession from the Church of Scotland was first declared, Its friends were not under the necessity of proving the leading principles in which their testimony in favor of the Reformation proceeded. This had been the work of their fathers, and they were not called to lay again the foundation, when there were few around them who attacked it. Their opponents, while they condemned them for testifying in the way of separation from the established church, went along with them in owning the whole doctrine of the Westminster Confession, the divine right of presbytery, and even the continued obligation of our national covenants. The state of matters is now, and has for a considerable time been, very different. All these have been attacked with great keenness from various quarters, and it no longer remains a matter of doubt or dispute that the greater part of seceders themselves have relinquished their adherence to the Reformation cause, and are disposed to call in question those things which were once most surely believed among them. A vindication of these has become more than ever necessary. This, however, is not proposed in these pages. All that I mean is to suggest a few things which may tend to obviate the difficulties of such as still feel attached to the cause, while their minds have been thrown into confusion and embarrassment by the specious and plausible objections which have been confidently advanced against it. And I shall endeavor to do this with all possible succinctness. One of the most common and startling objections brought forward is that which involves a charge against the Westminster Confession of Faith as favorable to persecution for conscience sake, and arming the civil magistrate with the power to punish good and peaceable subjects purely on the ground of their religious opinions and practices. This is a charge which affects all who have owned the confession, or who declare a simple adherence to it, and among these are many who, it will not be denied, have shown themselves strenuous friends of the rights of conscience, and who were not likely to subscribe any formulary which they had not examined and did not believe. The passage chiefly referred to is chapter 20, section 4. Let us try if it justifies the charge. In the second section, the doctrine of liberty of conscience is thus laid down. God alone is Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to his word, or besides it in matters of faith and worship. So that to believe such doctrines or to obey such commandments is to betray true liberty of conscience and reason also. And the requiring of an implicit faith and an absolute and blind obedience, is to destroy liberty of conscience and reason also. This is an important doctrine and necessary to be maintained against the encroachments and unwarrantable claims of every creature, and of rulers both civil and ecclesiastical. May every man then think and speak and act as he pleases, under the plea that his conscience gives him liberty to do so, or dictates to him that he ought to do so. To guard against this pernicious abuse of the doctrine is the object of what follows in the confession. In section 3, those are condemned who, upon pretense of Christian liberty, do practice any sin or cherish any lust. The design of section 4 is to guard against the abuse of the doctrine in reference to public authority. And because the powers which God hath ordained, and the liberty which Christ hath purchased, are not intended by God to destroy, but mutually to uphold and preserve one another, they who upon pretense of Christian religion shall oppose any lawful power, or the lawful exercise of it, whether it be civil or ecclesiastical, resist the ordinance of God. He who is the Lord of the conscience hath also instituted the authorities in church and state, and it would be in the highest degree absurd to suppose that he has planted in the breast of every individual a power to resist, counteract, and nullify his own ordinances.